Welcome to the Tenant Law Podcast, where all types of New York City tenants can learn about the laws that affect their apartments. Rent-stabilized tenants, free market tenants, good cause tenants, luxury tenants, loft law tenants, co-op shareholders, subletters, roommates, co-livers. Let's all learn to live better. Welcome to the Tenant Law Podcast. I am Michelle Itkowitz. As I record this, it's about 2 a.m. and we're going down into the 40s tonight for the first time this fall. And so we're talking heating requirements for New York City apartments and how to enforce those requirements. First, as always, let's set the stage with some context. New York City has a heating season. New York City Administrative Code Section 27-2029 sets up an 8-month heating season in New York City. So during the period from October 1st through May 31st, those 8 months are the heating season, and where there is centrally supplied heat in dwellings, the heat is required to be maintained at a certain level. What is that level? Well, during heating season, the day is divided. So let's do the easy one first. Nighttime. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the temperature has to be at least 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 62 degrees at night. During the daytime, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., a temperature of at least 68 degrees Fahrenheit has to be maintained whenever the outside temperature falls below 55 degrees. So during the daytime, which is 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., the apartment has to be 68 degrees unless the temperature outside is 55 degrees or higher. I'm linking in the show notes to the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, page on this topic that has a colorful chart that demonstrates it very nicely. And next, we are going to talk about what to do if these heating levels are not being maintained in any room in your apartment. Now, what do you do if the temperature levels we just talked about are not being maintained? You document the problem. Thoroughly document the lack of heat. I looked online, and for less than $20, you can buy an indoor wireless thermometer that simultaneously displays the 4 pieces of information that you need. You need the date, the time, the temperature outside, and the temperature inside. So you're going to make a spreadsheet, a chart. You're going to have a column for date, for time, for temperature outside, for temperature inside, and just fill up those rows with that information multiple times a day. And take a picture of the thermometer for each entry. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Don't just rely on the pictures. You really need to make the chart, but also take a picture. Then you're going to complain to the landlord. Complaints to the landlord should be made through the building's formal complaint process. If you have an online portal, do it that way and make sure that you keep a record of the complaint. If there's no formal complaint process, or if the formal complaint process is getting you an unsatisfactory response, then you should write a letter to the landlord and send the letter by email and overnight mail. Keep a copy of the letter, the email, and the mail receipts. By using overnight mail, you can track the letter's delivery process online, and you'll know that it got there. And enclose in the letter your chart and your pictures and your backup. Now, if that doesn't cause the problem to be rectified, the next step, the next link up the chain is you need to make an HPD complaint. Remember, I put the link in the show notes. Your HPD complaint will trigger the dispatch to your apartment of an HPD inspector. And once the inspector is on his way, now it's all about access. On the HPD website I linked you to, they have a widget that tells you how many heat complaints HPD has received so far this heating season. And this is really mind-blowing. Keep in mind, it's only 2 weeks into the heating season, and it says that New York City's received almost 5,000 heat complaints. So if each of those or most of those need to be followed up on by inspectors, you can see how important it is that you be there to meet the inspector. You must be home when your appointment is, and you must be listening for the inspector's arrival. If the inspector can't gain access, then you're not going to get a violation, and you need the violation to move the process forward. What happens if the inspector comes and on the day he gets there, we're having some kind of crazy heat wave and all of a sudden it's 80 degrees outside, so you wouldn't have the conditions for a violation? In that case, you just make another complaint the next time the problem happens and you try again. So what happens if you've made your HPD complaint and the inspector came, a violation was written, there's a violation of record, you can see it online on HPD against your building, but that still doesn't motivate management to get the heat on to where it should be. The next level up, the ultimate thing you can do, is called an HP proceeding. It stands for housing part. You do an HP proceeding in the New York City Civil Court located in the county which the apartment is located in. HP proceedings are governed by the New York City Civil Court Act, Section 110, and it sets up a mechanism for tenants to seek enforcement of state and local laws for the maintenance of housing standards. The HP part is set up for tenants to work without having lawyers. You'll be assisted by court clerks when you first go in filling out forms, so that will put your case on the calendar. At that time, you'll be assigned a court date. Make sure you can take that day off. The tenant is also given instructions about how to serve the court forms by mail on both the owner and HPD. You're required to notify HPD about your court case. There's a fee to file an HP proceeding, and that will be waived if you can't afford it. On the court date, bring your heating chart and your pictures, all well organized. When the proceeding appears on the court's calendar, the landlord will be represented by counsel. Tenants are usually not represented by counsel, and there will also be an attorney in the courtroom for HPD. And what typically happens in the first instance is the three parties enter into a stipulation that the court orders, and so the court is essentially ordering the landlord to get the heat on and correct the violation. Then the matter will appear again on the court's calendar to monitor the landlord's compliance. The HP proceeding doesn't result in the tenant getting a rent abatement from the court. This court is not set up to give that type of relief. That's another part of the court and a discussion for another day. This part of the court is for getting the heat back on. Okay, now in addition to the option of initiating an HP proceeding, only rent stabilized tenants may also file with the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, the DHCR, a complaint about the lack of heat. DHCR always has long names for things. So this particular form is called the Failure to Provide Heat and/or Hot Water Tenant Application for Rent Reduction. It's DHCR form HHW1, and again, of course, I have a link in the show notes. That form needs to be accompanied by a report from the appropriate city agency finding such lack of adequate heat. So you need to get the HPD violation in place before you can make the DHCR heat complaint. So if the owner is found by DHCR to have failed to provide adequate heat, a rent reduction shall be ordered. The rent will be knocked down to what it was before your last rent guidelines board increase, and the owner will be prohibited from collecting any additional rent increases until the service is restored. Now, this also is not the same as getting an abatement of your rent obligation because you went without services. This is something a little different. It's a punishment for the landlord. The rent is set back a level. The rent reduction order is going to stay in effect until the landlord applies to DHCR and receives a rent restoration order that finds the services have been restored. There's no fee for the DHCR, and the DHCR, too, is set up to work with tenants who do not have a lawyer. Finally, tenant associations can be very helpful in no heat situations as well, especially if it's building wide or a part of the building. Sometimes the whole building will bring heat cases against the landlord at the same time, and this is an instance where there really is strength in numbers. I have some tenant takeaways for you, but first, housekeeping. This is not legal advice, and I am not your lawyer, but because I am a lawyer, this might be considered legal advertising. If it's legal advertising, it's terrible because I'm asking you not to contact me. This pod is not a commercial for me or my law firm. This is simply the podcast that I always wanted to make. Let us know what topics you'd like to hear more about. If you deem this content worthy, please give us 5 stars and follow the podcast. That will get this important information to other people who might need it. It's time for the tenant takeaway. Tenant takeaway time. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So if you documented the lack of heat problem and complained formally to the landlord and you still don't have heat, then you have to get proactive. You have to take affirmative steps to enforce your rights because no one else is going to do that for you. The process is somewhat of a hassle, and it takes time. That's the difference between me and other sources of this type of information. I'm not trying to convince you that it's easy. I'm managing your expectations so that you actually stay engaged in the process. Do not give up. And this final piece of advice is the fill-in-the-blank ethnicity mother in me. Do not use space heaters improperly. Do not plug too many things into an outlet. Do not put the heater near fabric or garbage. Never leave the heater on when it's unattended, and never use an oven for heat. Stay warm, New York. And there you have it. Remember, New York City, the law belongs to you, but your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I am Michelle Itkowitz, and this is the Tenant Law Podcast.